Okay. All right. Well, thanks everyone for showing up. And I think you'll see a pretty interesting session this evening. Before I get into it, I'd like to give special thanks to Larry Ricketts and Alan Stern for all their work and making these things happen. These Zoom sessions would not happen without them. They are sort of like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain of pulling all the levers. So thanks to both of them for making it happen. Thanks also to our presenters. We had to turn a number of people away just for time. We could probably do another two or three Zooms based on the people that we had to turn away. I mean, whole groups like classmate physicians who are in military medicine around the world. So anyway, it's what we've got is a first flight of this effort. So going back to our final 2 years in Williamstown, we had the draft and we had the Vietnam War kind of hanging over us, and everybody had to kind of figure out how he was going to navigate all of this, and we all did sort of different things. Some got drafted. My roommate senior year got drafted out of his second year in law school in North Carolina into the Marine Corps of all things. Some went in the Peace Corps, some stayed in grad school, some got 4F, and others wound up in the military. And that's what we're going to focus on this evening. We did do the Peace Corps a few times ago, and that was fascinating too, with wide experiences. And I think you'll find a lot of wide experiences this evening. We have seven presenters tonight representing the Air Force, Army, and mostly Navy. Each person will present for about 5 or 7 minutes, and then after that, we'll open it up for a Q&A, and we won't be we won't be going into little breakout rooms. So with that, we're going to have to get started because we got a lot of people, and the first one up this evening is Jeff Bowen, Air Force in Vietnam.
Yep. Thank
Jeff?
you, Ken. Thank you. I will try to keep this down. I haven't pre-tested this. If I start getting too long-winded, I'll try to keep it short, or feel free to remind me. I know we got a lot of people who are presenting, but really appreciate this opportunity to reflect on the experience of the military. It was meaningful, and there were probably three different phases to it in my own experience. And I can summarize each of those hopefully quickly. The first part was the experience of getting into the military. I was in grad school at Johns Hopkins and received a draft notice halfway through a year's internship and teaching at Bethesda Chevy Chase High School in history. And that draft notice, which came on Valentine's Day, indicated that I would have to come into the military very fast. So since I was under a year's contract with my district, I went up to New Hampshire, met with my draft board, who was, I'm sure, convinced I was attempting to dodge the draft. And I got a promise from them that they would not have me drafted until the end of the school year. So with a little time left, I entered a delayed enlistment program in the Air Force. And then I had that following summer, and I signed up as an education specialist, which I was told meant that I'd probably be counseling stateside. It didn't mean that. When I got into basic training the following September, I found that it meant I would be in a program sent to Saigon, sent to Vietnam, and that I would be teaching Vietnamese air cadets and mechanics how to speak conversational English, so they could then be sent back to the States to learn more technical information. So I had 4 months at Saigon, which was no fun at all, a big dirty city, and then finally had an opportunity to get the heck out and go up to Nha Trang, midway up the coast, where I spent the rest of my year. And I spent a lot of time teaching, and in some ways it was quite enjoyable. The method used was mimicry and repetition, so I did not have to learn Vietnamese, thank God. And when I got through that whole experience and came back stateside. Then I had about 2.5 years left on an enlistment. I chose a place stateside, which I figured had air conditioning, which was base hospitals. And I ran an OJT program in a base hospital at a SAC base north of Sacramento for the next 2.5 years. And then once having gotten out of that, I went back into a doctoral program in New York State. And I had funding that came through from the military experience, which was great. Also had the VA mortgage, which really worked out wonderful. And the experience, the way I looked at it, there were some good sides and bad sides. I tried to look at the good side and see what I could gain from it. And certain things have sort of been residual ever since. I've been doing aerobics ever since, which is really great. And I've made a lot of friendships from it. And the experience was altogether a good one. I don't regret having been enlisted. And I still reflect upon it and have written about it extensively. So that kind of sums up my experience. I hope that does the trick, Ken. Did I take too much time? I'm not sure.
No, I've settled the hook.
Jeff,
Hook is not.
Jeff, did you want to show that photo?
What's
Yes.
that?
Let's start with that.
Sorry, Jeff Bowen. Hold on.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Wrong Jeff. Jeff Bowen, did you want to show that photo?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead if you got it.
Let's, I think, one more. There we go.
Yeah, there we go. That's me teaching Vietnamese air cadet how to speak conversational English. They liked the picture and they put it in the Stars and Stripes, got it in the hometown newspaper. And actually, when I got out, I was a staff sergeant, so I got 4 stripes overall. But that's probably the best picture that came out of the whole thing.
And how old are those guys?
They ranged from about 18 years old to some of them were fairly old, upwards of 25, 28 years old. So there were some who were married. Most of them were young guys, maybe 18 to 20 years old.
Wow. Okay.
You look fairly frustrated there. Will
No,
you
I was just
get
being
this-
dramatic in that picture.
Oh, that's great. Okay, well, thanks, Jeff.
You're welcome.
All right, so next up is Harry Tether, the Army.
Thanks, Ken. My military experience didn't have the happiest start as in graduate school in 1968 after the Tet Offensive, I lost my draft deferment. And in January 1969, I was drafted. And I had just paid for my last semester in graduate school. And that was the only reason they allowed me to finish that year. And they wanted to see with a raised seal that I had paid to Columbia University. So they they were really short in my draft board of walking and warm potential recruits. So I I entered the military. I was inducted at Whitehall, as some of you may know, in southern Manhattan, which is commonplace to get inducted on June 30th, 1969. And the event of that day was the Army had changed from what they call the RA number in your dog tag to a Social Security number. And I actually had probably 10 seconds of network TV showing both the dog tags. I wasn't a happy camper. So I spent 8 weeks in basic training, which turned out to be a very interesting social experience because many of the recruits came from Puerto Rico. This was Fort Jackson, South Carolina. And many of them didn't speak much English, and neither did the drill sergeants. So it was difficult for these recruits. They ended up doing a lot of push-ups, and understanding English was a big part of getting through. And then following that, I had enlisted, having done some research in military intelligence, which turned out to be a very interesting experience. It was 26 weeks at Fort Holabird, which is near Baltimore. And we learned how to be a spy, or the life cycle of a spy, because our job was not to be the spy, but we were meant to recruit and brief and dispatch agents. And so that was really fascinating. Reading spy novels has become an interesting part of what I do. And during the 26 weeks, my girlfriend, now my wife, who was working on Capitol Hill, was able to find out the orders for my MI company, which happened to be 80 to 90% directly to Vietnam, or something called Fort Bliss, Texas Vietnamese Village, where we were going to learn Vietnamese language. Neither of those options looked very good. So I applied to OCS, was accepted at Army OCS at Fort Belvoir, which is the engineering OCS. And while I'm in the holding company, this is now well into my 2 years, they came back and decided to close Fort Belvoir's training. And the Army made an unusual offer. They said, if I really want to be an officer, I could go to Fort Benning in the infantry, or Fort Sill in the armor and artillery. Better part of the option was they take a year off my enlistment and send me anywhere in the world that my MOS was active. So that offered an opportunity to get engaged and get married. My wife and I decided that Munich, Germany was a good choice. And actually, it turned out to be terrific. The military side of what I did in Munich was actually kind of fun. We'd go to guest houses and listen to people having a couple beers, and we discovered that there were many disaffected East Germans and Czechs who would often work for our MI company without any payment. And so we'd refer them back to other people who'd brief them and recruit them further. And so that was the military part of what I did in Munich. But a lot more fun was being in the center of Europe with 40-cent a gallon Army gas coupons. And if you look at Munich, it's really kind of the center of Europe. And we were able in the next year to, with the generous leave policy of the Army, to see much of Europe, which I couldn't have done if I was a civilian and working. So the experience that started out with me is kind of desperate. I was unhappy to be pulled out of, my career plan, but it turned out in the end to be a very positive learning experience, both with people that I wouldn't meet in my career, and with the opportunity to learn German and live in Germany for a year. So it was positive and rewarding, and I'd call it my brief and unspectacular Army experience.
All right.
Well, that's great. And again, we're holding questions until the end of all of the
Right.
presentation. There he is.
That's a photo outside my barracks, and the guy in the tighty whities, I don't think he wanted to be photoed either, but
Photobombed.
But this is what I mentioned. The second half of my experience was terrific. I mean, if you're in Munich, you're probably no more than a couple hours from some of the best skiing in Europe, and weekends and vacations. As I said, it ended up to be a very positive year.
Well, very good. Thanks, Harry. We now shift to the Navy, and all the remaining presenters are all Navy. So leading the parade is Bill Clendaniel. Bill?
Well, like the two who's just spoken, I came in a rather fortunate way. I had gone to Oxford after Williams and was in my somewhere in my first year, and you have to spend 2 years at Oxford to get a degree. And suddenly I got this draft notice. But I was extraordinarily fortunate in that my father's half-time secretary. Her other half, she worked for the Selective Service Board. And she literally went up to Montpelier in Vermont and persuaded them to let me stay if I went into the embassy in London and swore on a stack of Bibles that I would go to Navy OCS. The Navy, as many of you know, I had sailed over to England to get to Oxford, and I love the sea. I've sailed all my life. I'm still sailing. So the Navy was definitely appealing. And for whatever reason, I did very well at OCS. I stood number 2 in my class, and that allowed me to choose where I wished to go. Well, having seen destroyers come into Newport in the middle of winter, I had no desire to be in the Atlantic Fleet. And I thought, Pearl Harbor sounds interesting. So I was assigned to a guided missile destroyer in Pearl Harbor, and I served on her for my entire 3 years. Pictures will come along later. She was a real ship, unlike some of the modern craft that looked like those Tesla machines that looked like tanks. She had a clipper bow, and she moved along very fast. So it was exciting. I was sent to San Diego for schools, and probably for the first and only time in my life, I flunked out. I had a class to air control fighter pilots, and I couldn't hack it. So they sent me to helicopters, slower speed, and I could do that. All right. But I love San Diego. I met my future wife there. And the BOQ was filled, so they sent me to a luxurious condominium in a resort area of San Diego. And every time I went back, they would send me there again. And it was wonderful. If any of you have ever been there, it's apparently still there, the catamaran. And that sort of got me off to a great start in the Navy, which is famous, I think, for giving, a very good quarters, very good food, and that certainly was true in my case. I did a lot of small boat sailing in Colorado in my off time, and I love being in California. I'd been there before for the summer after my junior year at Williams. Neil O'Donnell, his father, Admiral and Monterey, furnished a lot of nice benefits. So it's nice to be back in California. And then finally, I got sent to Oahu, where I got a little apartment because it wasn't much fun living on the ship. But right opposite the ship was a lovely swimming pool and tennis courts. I stayed away from the tennis courts because the person playing tennis all the time was the admiral in charge of all American forces in the Pacific, the father of McCain. And you didn't want to get very near him or have him even observe you. But the swimming pool was very nice. Well, eventually, before we went to Westpac, we did a lot of training off the island of Kauai. If any of you have been to Hawaii, you know how beautiful the islands are, each of them different. We'd finish our exercises shooting torpedoes and then cruise up and down the Nepali coast, which is one of the most beautiful places on this earth. Fired the guns off Kaho'olawe, went down to Maui. It was a wonderful place to go out to sea and do your training. I started out as an assistant CIC officer, which meant I spent my time just behind the bridge in the Combat Information Center looking at radars. But I was, I was very glad I wasn't down in the engine room. I wasn't out on the deck with the bosun mates. I was either in the bridge or just behind it. My second tour, I became the navigator. And that meant I spent all my time on the bridge, which I loved. Our destroyer was the first in the Pacific Fleet to have a satellite navigation system, which helped. We still took sextant sightings, but Loran was not very good, and it was really nice to have that more sophisticated backup. Nothing like what they have today, of course. I made 2 trips to the Western Pacific as part of the Vietnam War, but to call it war for us was really, it wasn't. We may hear later, I think someone's going to talk about riverboats, but we were in absolutely no danger. Our duties consisted of firing our guns into the DMZ, which I figured anybody still in the DMZ would be crazy. And if they knew the movie schedule, they could have decided when we were firing the guns, because after each reel of movies, then everybody would jump up and go fire the guns, and then they'd come back to the movie. I mean, it was very hard to take this terribly seriously. We ate extremely well, getting our food off the carriers. That was one of the most exciting things in what was largely a very dull operation, working with the carriers. We would come alongside and get food and fuel and so forth, and that was sort of exciting. You peeled out afterwards like a sports car. I got to spend a day on the America, on the bridge, sitting next to the captain, who later became the CNO. I was a lonely JG, and my counterpart, of course, was a full lieutenant commander, but that was exciting to watch a carrier in operation. But you didn't really feel like you were on a ship. It was like steady, whereas we're pitching up and down, following the carrier, trying to pick up anyone who went in the drink. The best part was I got to see the Pacific. They say join the Navy and see the world. We were in a station ship in Hong Kong for a full week. Kind of a serendipitous, unpleasant serendipitous, though I could look out from the quarterdeck and see the original Queen Elizabeth, on which I had gone to England as an exchange student before going to Williams, lying over on her side, turtled up. She was being broken up. But Hong Kong was fascinating, of course, watching all the activity in the harbor. We went to Taiwan. We would go to Kaohsiung and Keelung. Got to see the nationalist museum of all the treasures from China that they took over with them. Of course, we spent a lot of time in the Philippines, Subic Bay, which was very picturesque, but kind of a hellhole because of all the military going through, and that didn't create very good atmosphere for the Filipinos. I did set foot on soil in Vietnam on the dock in Da Nang one Thanksgiving. And another typical story of the Navy is we were there for Thanksgiving, and the cooks came up and complained to the captain that they couldn't cook the turkeys because we were rolling too much in the harbor. So he just pulled up the anchor, and we steamed up and down the coast of Vietnam while the turkeys cooked, and then went back to our station. Food was always very important to the Navy. We showed the flag. We went to Sydney for the Sydney Hobart race, and then went on to Tasmania. We went to Portland for the Rose Festival. Had fun tracking a Soviet sub on the way back to Hawaii. Spent a lot of time in Japan. Bringing a destroyer, at least, into Hong Kong Harbor is sort of like being in a 8-lane highway with everyone going way over the speed limit. It was one of the most scary things I'd ever observed. All these ships of all kinds in their lane, all going very fast. It was truly terrifying. The other terrifying things were sea detail, getting into Pearl Harbor. It's a very, very narrow and very shallow harbor. In fact, the carriers would complain that they'd literally ground out on their way in. You know, they'd suck up the mud into their systems. Destroyers, of course, are not so deep, but it was very, very tricky to maneuver, and it really pulled out all my ability as a navigator going in and out of Pearl Harbor. Experienced a typhoon in the Philippines. One of my best collateral duties as Special Services Officer, I was detailed to provide travel entertainment for the troops when we got into port, and I took full advantage of it. But we were in the jungles of the Philippines when the typhoon came through. I worried that we'd get back in time, but we did.
Bill, if you could wrap it
Columbia
up in
River.
a minute or two.
Bill,
Yep.
you want to show those photos?
Yeah, went up the Columbia River, another scary sea detail. So I look at this as that was our position for days and days at a time, smelling the stink of a carrier. They would launch the planes going fast, of course, and then go down to 5 knots. And then we would pitch and roll smelling those fumes. That was not fun. Well, that's just no great thing, except that it got me where I wanted to go on this ship. And, I got to live my life up there on the bridge, which was great. I figured my day consisted of, climbing up 20 feet and going down and maybe 10 feet back to the wardroom and to my bunk. And that was about it. I never, unless I deliberately walked around, you don't get much exercise. We all look so young in those days. I mean, it's just astonishing. We were young. And I guess the thing that I learned that was useful in my future life was how to be this young person who really knew very little, but was put in charge of a bunch of older guys who knew exactly what they were doing, and you had to be their leader. And I think I was successful, and I had that same experience later in my career. And so those lessons learned were valuable. That's the sink pack. The Navy is admiral in charge of Pacific Fleet, and it was a typical snafu. He was supposed to helicopter onto the ship. The communications broke down. It was just one ridiculous disaster after another. I mean, and then this is what, this is the Goldsboro, my ship, and the Wainwright, which was a cruiser that we were working with. This is what we spent our days in the Sea of Japan doing, running races. Meanwhile, up above us, next picture. Well, no, that's there was a Russian bomber going over, looking at us. Maybe they weren't taking things any more seriously, but it was. I came away thinking, we really we had a great time. A lot of it was boring, but it was fun. We eat well. And was it really war? No, it wasn't for us. This is in Portland with my aunt.
Thank you,
Well,
Bill.
very good. Thanks, Bill. Okay, next up is David Nash.
Thank you, Ken. I appreciate being here, and thanks for all of you showing up for this meeting. There's a lot of parallels to what I've heard from speakers so far. None of us wanted to go on shore in Vietnam. And when I went through OCS in January to June of 1968, one of the things we had to do was go tour ships in Newport Harbor. And I spent the better part of a day bashing my head into the overheads as you walked from one compartment to another. And I immediately thought, this is not for me. I do not want to be on a ship. I would not survive. So in the latter part of the time at OCS, I was figuring out how to get shore duty. And I heard about communication stations that the Navy had around the world, and they were all, of course, on shore. But there was a new one being built in Western Australia. And I thought, well, maybe that's a good place to go. So I told my detailer I'd like to go to Western Australia. And sure enough, I did get orders before I left to go there with an interim stop in San Diego for training, which was almost worthless. But nevertheless, you had to do that. So I finally got my orders to go from August to go to Travis Air Force Base and board a C-141 to fly to Western Australia. The flight time was going to be 24 hours in the air, but we had stops along the way. And when I heard about this, I thought I've got to do something to take my time while I'm riding on the ship. So I had a copy of a book that I'm sure all of you remember by William Shire called The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. And it was 1,000 pages long, 1,000 pages. I read the entire book on that flight from California to Western Australia. So here's a map and I'll show you where we were. The base was at Exmouth on the far northwestern corner of Australia. Australia is actually about the same size as the US, but all the people are on the coast: Brisbane, Canberra, Perth, Melbourne, and Adelaide. That's where about 90% of the population was. The rest of the country is just wide open. And, the Australians called this the outback. And that was absolutely about as good a description of that as you could have had. So I got off this plane. It was 100 degrees. And the airport, such as it was just a landing strip that the Australians had built during World War II in case one of their planes had to make an emergency landing. So we landed there. There was nothing else there other than a station to, put new fuel on the plane so they could fly back to New South Wales and go back to the United States. And I remember thinking as I got off that plane, what the hell have I done? Who came up with this brilliant idea to spend 3 years in this God-forsaken country? So anyway, that was the low point of that whole time. But we got to the base, and my wife was still in the United States at that time. And they did find a house for me in the town of Exmouth. So she flew over in December. And it's an irony right now with the weather up there. It was 20 below when she left. When she got to Western Australia 2 days later, it was 120 degrees on the runway. So she had a 140-degree temperature change in the course of 2 days. And that was quite a challenge, to say the least. So the base was really 900 miles north of Perth. And there was a road that ran from Perth to a place called Geraldton. That was a real road. After that, all the way to Coral Bay and to Exmouth, a one-lane dirt road. And the road was just covered with kangaroos. I can't tell you how many big red kangaroos I saw along the way. And you certainly don't want to tangle with those guys. They're very nasty and they love to fight. But we made that trip back and forth to Perth a couple of times, just on the times we had off. So that was a bit of a struggle. I had a Volkswagen Beetle that the Navy graciously delivered to me at Exmouth, and we used that to go back and forth. Now, the base there was a VLF facility, which is very low frequency, and our job was to broadcast a signal into the Indian Ocean, to some extent the Atlantic Ocean, to some extent the Pacific Ocean. There were 5 of these stations around the world, and this was the biggest one. It cost $100 million to build this thing. And the VLF signal, its mission was to penetrate the water and provide information on a 24/7 basis to the submarines out in the Indian Ocean. We didn't know how many were out there. We never talked back to them. We just broadcast this signal 24/7. But what was likely to happen, unfortunately it did not, that if they ever needed to fire their missiles, this was how they would get the communication, is from these naval communication stations. Very powerful signal. I never could figure out how far down in the water it would go. I asked all the experts on that, and they just kind of smiled at me like this is classified information. I said, well, I have a top secret clearance. Nope, sorry, you can't hear it. Well, we finally figured out that signal went about 2,000 feet into the water. So there was a pretty good way for them to communicate with those submarines. And I had 2 jobs while I was at the station. The first one was standing watch in a communication center, for which I had no training. And it was the same comment that Bill made about everybody that reported to me. I had 10 or 15 sailors They were all quite a bit older than me. And they had to call me Mr. Nash, which I thought was absurd. Just call me David. It'd be a lot easier. No, we can't do that. That's not what the Navy required. But it was a challenge. Thank God I had some good people with me, and we never got into trouble. My daughters came down to Florida for my 80th birthday. And one of them was saying, well, now, Dad, what did you do when you stood watch? And I said, I didn't do anything. Well, what do you mean you didn't do anything? And I said, I stood watch. And all of us, I'm sure, know about standing watch because we all had to do it at some point in time. And what did you do? You stood watch and waited for something bad to happen. Fortunately, nothing bad happened, but that was a very strange kind of a thing where you are actually responsible for a $100 million facility for two of the three watch times that you were on. And it became more intimidating after I got out of the military and thought about what they were relying on a 23-year-old ensign with no real training. But that's the way the military worked. They just threw you into a job and then you had to do the best you could. The second job I had was security officer for the base. Now, Western Australia was not exactly, Da Nang. There were no real threats to the security, although we did have M1s, but the captain had the key and he was usually out fishing because he had nothing to do either. So I think maybe I was the only one who knew how to fire an M1 because, as you guys know, we had to do that at OCS. But and I never got shot at, so that was probably the best thing about all of that. But yeah, it's just the military was strange. I had to do a budget, which I had never done before, so that was pretty good training for my next job. But it's very strange how you're tossed into these jobs without really knowing what the hell you're doing, and you just kind of figure it out along the way. So this was, when I think back on this experience, the things that you had to do, the difficulty of the environment was unbelievable. I mean, that kind of weather and the flies that would assault you when you came outside, you had to be flexible and you had to adapt because there was not a thing you could do about it. And I think having the responsibility of both security and on standing watch in the communications center was very good because, you could toss anything at you wanted in business. And it couldn't have been any more intimidating than that, with feeling that you're so completely untrained to do it. But it was very interesting. We got a chance to travel a lot. I went over to New Zealand, played a tennis tournament on grass for the first time in my life. And I realized that was not going to be the last time that I would play on grass. I loved it. And we traveled around Australia, Brisbane, Sydney, Perth, Melbourne, and so on. And it's a fascinating country. So I guess when I look back on it, it was a challenging duty to have that, but it was an amazing experience. My first child was born in Australia, so that was wonderful. And, I've been back there a few other times to play tennis, and I would love to go back again. It's just one hell of a long ways to go. So that's about it.
Okay, thanks, David. That was very good. Okay, next up is Jeff Kelleher, which was a little bit more active.
Bill Clendaniel, I was on Wainwright in the Tonkin Gulf at the same time you were working with her, and I got caught in that same typhoon that you mentioned. So we'll discuss this in due course. Alan, you there? Let's put up the map, please.
Okay.
I think it's 2. It's slide 2.
Okay, you got it.
All right. This obviously is the Tonkin Gulf. Excuse me. I'm still back there. This is the Mekong Delta, 15,000 square miles of the most fertile soil in the world, and thousands of miles of rivers and canals. When America came into the war in 1965, the Viet Cong basically owned the Delta. And they were resupplied by their allies in North Vietnam through 2 routes. The first one was the famous Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos and Cambodia and terminating right at the southern border of Cambodia. The second route was the port of Sihanoukville over on the Gulf of Thailand to the left, which you can't see here, but the communist freighters would land there, unload, and the weapons and ammunition would be transported then across and infiltrated down into the Delta. Now, the only way to get around in the Delta, the only mode of transport was by water. And water is the domain of the Navy. So the Navy took it as its mission to deny that transport to the communists. The trouble was they had no inshore craft suitable for the purpose. So they cast around in the civilian world to see if they could find boats already in production that could be adapted. And they found two. One was an oil rig resupply boat, steel hull, 50 feet long, 4-foot draft. And that became the PCF or Swift boat. The other one, let's go to the next slide there, Alan, the boat, slide 3.
Coming up.
There we are. This is the craft that I served on. And the hull was a civilian pleasure craft, fiberglass, 31 feet long, powered by two V6 diesel engines that put out almost 500 horsepower. And the boat was propelled by two jacuzzi water jet pumps, which shot powerful jets of water out the stern. And they also swiveled in response to the helm. So those water jets both propelled the boat and steered it. There was no screw, there was no rudder. The armament you can see some of. First of all, there was a twin 50 caliber turret forward. There was a single 50 caliber aft. Not shown on this photo, there were two light machine guns, M60 machine guns amidships, port and starboard, right behind where those two guys are standing. We also had grenade launchers, M16s, and shotguns. Each boat was manned with a crew of 4. The boat captain was a first-class petty officer, an E6, and there was a gunner's mate and an engineman and a seaman, and everyone was trained on everybody else's job. Operationally, the PBRs were divided into divisions, 10 boats, 60 men each division. There were about 30 divisions in Vietnam at maximum, not all operational at the same time. So the total personnel on the river were about 1,500 men, about 300 boats. The casualty rate was 30%. So statistically, you had a 1 in 3 chance of being a casualty. The kill rate was about 1.5%, which sounds low, but it actually was more than the infantry. All right, let's go back to the map, please, Alan. I operated out of 3 bases, which I have marked here. They were very different from each other, and the mission was very different at each base. We don't have time for me to go through all of them, so I'm going to focus in on just one, and that's Muc Wa. So if you would, Alan, zero in on Muc Wa.
That's as far as we can zoom.
What happened here was in 1968, we pretty much had, the Navy had pretty much had control of the main rivers, but a lot of stuff was still getting through. A way to block that off. We had a new commander of the naval forces in Vietnam, Elmo Zumwalt, and he came up with a plan called Sea Lords. And Sea Lords was designed to create a waterborne barrier all the way across the southern boundary, the southern border of Cambodia, which it was possible to do because there is a series of interlinked canals and rivers that roughly follow the border. Can you drop down a little bit, Alan? Drop that map. No, back to the map. And anyway, you can see here, we'll go back and zero in. In particular, one of the main transport points and one of the most dangerous places was the so-called Parrot's Beak, which it's that protrusion of Cambodia that protrudes into Vietnam, and it points right at Saigon, you can see. And so the mission was to seal that off. It happens that there were two rivers that straddled the Parrot's Beak, and I have marked them there. That's that mark, that black, the Vamkodong on the east and the Vamkote on the left. Those rivers, and so Zumwalt put 6 divisions in there, 3 on each river, and I was at Mukwa, right under the wing of the Parrot up there. And we were given 30 miles of river and ordered to interdict. The method, that river, by the way, unlike the big rivers that you see down in the middle of the delta, that river was 80 yards wide. And it was mostly up in that area uninhabited, so free fire was on. We operated mostly at night, and the tactic was to take the boats. You'd take 2 or 4 or 6 boats and go up the river. We couldn't run around. Our boats were noisy, so we couldn't go running up and down with our noisy boats, so we would be detected. So the tactic was to go up, and each boat would cut its engine and peel off and sail in and float into the bank and hide itself in the foliage on the bank. Or alternatively, we would go all the way up the river and float down, and each one would peel off, and we would float into the bank and sit there waiting for the enemy to cross. All right, let's go to the next slide, the first photograph there, Alan. I think it's slide 4. Okay, that's it. That is the Vamkote River at Mukwa. We're looking north. If you go about 3 or 4 miles up that river, you hit Cambodia. There's our pitiful guard tower with our pitiful single machine gun there, and that was our tactical support center. I took the first night patrol once we arrived up that river. Once we got past, this was at dusk, and once we got past Mukwa, we were just beyond. There was a large branch of a tree that jutted out over the river, and hanging from that branch was a banner that had a Viet Cong flag, and in English it said, "Welcome to Mukwa River Division 535." So they knew we were coming, and they knew who we were. And I thought, oh shit, we're going to get hit every night on that bloody river. Well, it turned out not so. We only had, in the 2.5 months, 2 full-on firefights. One boat got hit with B-40 rocket and beached, but we got them out of there, nobody killed, and that was the extent of it. I mean, we did get mortared on the base quite a lot. We got sniped at, but we did not have the kind of major combat that I was afraid of. All right, next photo, Alan. There is our tactical support base. It is floating on metal pontoons called ammies. In the foreground there is a small boat that a Boston whaler that we would run around to town with. And there again is our pitiful watchtower. All right, next. There we are. These are the living quarters. That wooden cubicle on the right is the latrine with a shrapnel hole in the bottom of it. And if you look closely, you can see that it protrudes out over the river, and there is a 2-holer right above that protrusion. Next photo. All right, that's just another view of the boats. And here we have the M60 machine guns are visible in midships. You notice they're sticking up in the air there. Almost every boat had those. All right, next photo, Alan. There is looking from our operations center across the river into Indian country, and you can see how exposed we were. That tree line on the horizon is Cambodia. All right, next. That's from my boat, the lead boat. I think I did not explain. The boats always ran in pairs. There was, unlike Apocalypse Now, no boat ever went out on a solo mission. And the pair was commanded by a patrol officer, who Lieutenant JG, as I was, or a chief petty officer. And so you had a lead boat and a cover boat. I'm in the lead boat, and I'm looking back at my cover boat. All right, next. There's my cover boat coming up alongside. And next, there's your Lieutenant JG and my friend there. That's Ba Schwinn. She was our hooch maid and laundress. All the guys thought she was a Viet Cong, and she probably was. Next. All right, this is the last picture, and it's my favorite one because the kids were always fascinated with us. Anytime we went into a village, they would come running down. No doubt it had something to do with our passing out treats and so forth, but not only that, they were truly interested. And I like this picture because it demonstrates how fearful and intimidated they were by the big bad Americans. You can see that they are completely at ease sitting in the bow of our boat next to the 50 cal. All right, so the other two, Nabe and Canto, were very different, but we don't have time, so we'll end it there.
Jeff, would you remind us what PBR stands for?
Patrol Boat River.
And the Swift boat was similar but larger?
Swift boat, well, our boat was 31 feet and fiberglass, and had no screws or rudder. Swift boat was 50 feet, steel hulled, and it was propelled by a screw. And one of the big differences was that our boats was in the draft. Our boats, fully loaded, sitting still, the draft was 2 feet. At speed, up on step, it was 6 inches. And the Swift boat had a draft of 4 feet, so we could go places it couldn't.
Great, thank you.
Great. Well, thanks, Jeff. That was an interesting set of orders that you had that brought you to that place. Yikes. Okay, well, I'm next up here, and I got into the Navy much like sort of everybody else. I was in grad school. General Hershey did away with grad school deferments, and so I went down to my friendly naval recruiter and applied for OCS, and specifically the Supply Corps, which was the finance and logistics arm of the Navy. And since I was at the University of Minnesota trying to get an MBA, I thought that was fairly close. So anyway, I went to Navy OCS in Newport, the 4-month program there, and then down to the Navy Supply School in Athens, Georgia for another 6 months. I was with Neil O'Donnell, who was in my company at OCS, and we both wound up down at Athens, Georgia, and wound up with another guy renting part of a house for the whole time we were there. We both wound up on ships home ported in Japan, in Yokosuka, Japan, which is what I had asked for. We both flew over on the same military flight to Japan, stopping in Wake, Midway, Okinawa. It was kind of a shuttle. Anyway, and our ships were docked just across the way from each other for much of the time when we were in Japan. Anyway, he was on a destroyer. I was on the only ship of its kind in the Navy with a hull number of 1 because it was unique, and it was an inshore fire support rocket ship. It fired just rockets, not missiles. The range on them was about a mile, so we could always see what we were shooting at. Alan, do you have the one picture of it?
Sure.
Okay, well, this is a map. We see Japan, which is where we were home ported in Yokosuka, which was the major World War II Japanese port, about an hour train ride from south of Tokyo. Philippines, we were in a lot, at Subic Bay in the dry dock, and then Vietnam was where we spent much of our time right there. And so the ship itself, there you go. So it was about 2/3 the size of a destroyer. it looked more as though you took the a destroyer and cut off the back end of it, and everything was in the bow. So we had 8 rapid fire rocket launchers. You saw the 5-inch gun, and we were bristled with 40 millimeter cannon and all the rest of it because we were in pretty close to shore. We have a video if it works of let's try it out.
You want to give a little introduction to it, Kenny?
Okay. So this is the USS Carronade, which is in the foreground here with the hull number 1. Those other 3 ships behind are World War II LSMRs, also rocket ships, but ours was much had been upgraded, much faster firing, and so we were the flagship for that little squadron of inshore fire support rocket ships. This video was taken about 2 months before I reported on board. It was flat bottom ship, kind of rough, but anyway, let's roll it. This shows how the ship operated.
It's about a minute and a half. So
What's that?
it's about a minute and a half. So if you want me to pause it at any time, let me know.
Okay.
And it has sound.
Vietnam, headed by the flagship Carronade, a U.S. task force of Navy amphibious rocket ships prowls the coast. These compact vessels rival the firepower of even cruisers. They've been bombarding Viet Cong targets for more than 18 months. Highly accurate firing is directed from onboard control centers. The attack being mounted here was on a target just south of the town of Quan Ting. It was pretty devastating. The offshore barrage unleashed over 1,200 rockets. The Americans reported close on 80 structures destroyed or badly damaged. Secondary explosions indicated that Viet Cong ammunition dumps had been hit. Sunsets meant the end of the day, but not of the party. War is a terrible thing, even more terrible when there seems little prospect of peace in the offing.
Okay. This is a picture of me. I'm on the right there with our XO and the captain of a Vietnamese gunboat that we used to operate with. He invited us on board for some coconut, so that was a moment off. So we carried a magazine of about 10,000 rockets, and we'd load them out at Cam Bay and then fire them all off, then go back and reload. Those rocket launchers could fire something like 30 rockets a minute. So you had 8 launchers if they were all going. I mean, you could put out a lot of rockets. And in spite of what they said about highly accurate, it was not. These were spin stabilized, and so you kind of hoped that they would land in the neighborhood, and we made up for a lack of accuracy with volume. So we could take out a city block and nothing flat. Anyway, we were in the Philippines quite a lot in Subic Bay because as a one-of-a-kind ship, things broke down. So we're often in the dry dock there, but spent most of our time in Vietnam, then would occasionally get back to Japan. As this was the second ship, we brought that first ship back to the Seattle area in Bremerton and put it out of commission, and I was transferred to this ship that was a brand new ship, the USS Shreveport. That's a much bigger ship, obviously. We put it into commission, and my job was making sure it had all the spare parts and equipment that that was authorized for it. We brought it around to its home port in Norfolk, went down the coast from Seattle, across the equator, went through the Panama Canal, and as the USS Shreveport, we were invited to Mardi Gras. So went up the Mississippi to New Orleans and were feted there, and ultimately wound up in Guantanamo for shakedown training. Took the midshipmen for their summer cruise off to Europe. And then I was released early so I could go back to finish my second year of grad school. I stayed in the reserves for a total of 30 years. The last 5 years I was at the headquarters of the Pacific Command, basically running war games for a potential another Korean War outbreak. So anyway, that was my story. And so I will transfer now to Ted McPherson to wrap us
Thank
up.
you. Thank you, Ken. Alan, please show the first slide, the Defense Intelligence Agency logo. Tonight, I'm speaking for the first time publicly about my military experience. The Marine Security Guards crisply saluted the United States Navy Admiral in the black limousine hurrying to the White House Situation Room. Admiral Daniel Bergen's dark blue Navy uniform was highly decorated with colorful rows of military medals and gold stripes. I was sitting next to him in the limousine with only one military award, the National Defense Service Ribbon, simply handed out to every member of the armed forces during the Vietnam era, and wearing a single gold stripe circling the bottom of each sleeve of my ensign's uniform. Admiral Bergen's sole assignment that afternoon was escorting me from the Defense Intelligence Agency to the White House Situation Room. Next slide. My purpose that afternoon in the White House Situation Room was briefing Dr. Henry Kissinger, shown standing here, the National Security Advisor to President Nixon, about our current and strategic intelligence on the secret war in Laos and the fighting in Vietnam. By signing the Geneva Accords in 1962, the United States designated Laos a neutral country in which no American ground troops would operate. In the secret war in Laos, we used military advisors, the Central Intelligence Agency's covert Air America airline, and indigenous mercenaries. The North Vietnamese ignored the Geneva Accords by continuing sending extensive troops and supplies down the vital Ho Chi Minh Trail on the eastern border of Laos and into South Vietnam. Next slide. Earlier at 4 a.m. that morning, I had entered the river entrance of the Pentagon in time to prepare for my daily meeting with Air Force Major General Richard Stewart, Deputy Director of Intelligence, and for Army Lieutenant General Donald Bennett, Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. As the senior military intelligence analyst on the secret war in Laos, I had earned respect for my knowledge and ability under pressure for articulating the intentions and capabilities of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, and results produced by America's Hmong mercenaries led by General Vang Pao. I was cleared for top secret and special compartmentalized satellite, electronic, and human intelligence, interacting with the Central Intelligence Agency, National Security Agency, State Department, and all the military services. I was on duty 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, often receiving a telephone call in the middle of the night ordering me to report immediately to the Pentagon. Next slide. My focus in 3 years of active duty was on watching the fighting near the Plain of Jars in northern Laos, evaluating coordinates for bombing targets, thereby directly answering the question, what's in a box, assessing attacks codenamed Lam Son 719 in the Ashau Valley on the Laos border, tracking covert incursions into Cambodia, and contributing to the planning of the raid on the Son Tay prison camp in North Vietnam, led by Colonel Bull Simons in 1970, attempting to free captured United States fighter pilots. The Son Tay tactics were replicated 41 years later in 2011, killing Osama bin Laden. I worked with 11 legendary leaders, Bill Sullivan, ambassador to Laos, orchestrator of the secret war in Laos, Army Brigadier General Donald Blackburn, counterinsurgency and special operations, and Air Force Brigadier General Leroy Manor, pilot of 275 F-100 combat missions in Vietnam. Next slide. My collateral duties included transporting hard copies of highly sensitive intelligence from inside the Pentagon's vast National Military Command Center, shown here as it looked in 1969, to Major General Stewart's secure office, a distance of only 50 yards. I carried a locked briefcase handcuffed to my wrist, accompanied by 2 protective military police armed with automatic rifles. It was also mandatory when traveling on commercial airlines that I inform agency security officials as my protection against hijackings to Cuba. Next slide. The real insider was my wife, Sally McPherson, relating her meeting one afternoon with our commander-in-chief. Sally, teaching at National Cathedral School, was a colleague or friend of Julie Nixon Eisenhower, like Sally, a graduate of Smith College. Julie had invited both of them spontaneously to visit the White House to meet President Nixon and return a week later to watch a movie in the White House theater with the president and his family. Sally wore the red, white, and blue dress on which we splurged for that movie for several years afterwards. Next slide. Toward the end of my 3 years of active duty, I was promoted to lieutenant junior grade and awarded the Joint Service Commendation Medal in 1971 for, quote, outstanding professional competence, sound judgment, and expert knowledge in an assignment that demanded the utmost in versatility, perseverance, and resourcefulness. Next slide. It would be 30 years later, in 2001, when I was again escorted to the White House, where I was interviewed in the West Wing prior to President George W. Bush, Bush 43, nominating me twice for major national federal appointments confirmed by the United States Senate. I was America's Undersecretary of Education and precedingly as Chief Financial Officer of the United States Department of Agriculture, USDA, of which only 4 private sector companies are larger. I was one of 5 members of the Executive Committee of the President's Management Council, as well as serving on the National Aeronautics and Space Administration Advisory Council for 4 years. I spent my first day at USDA on September 11th, 2001, in an underground top-secret bunker in Washington, D.C., after feeling the pounding thud of the nearby crash of the terrorist airplane at 9:30 a.m. Next slide. On 9/11, Washington was in complete chaos. F-16 jet fighter planes, shown here, roaring up and down the mall, cell phones jamming, traffic freezing except for armored vehicles speeding across sidewalks and grass parks. America was struggling at Defense Condition 3, military readiness, 1 notch below the Cuban Missile Crisis, and only 2 steps below nuclear war. I was now serving in my second war, the war on terrorism. Next slide. While serving in these presidential appointed positions, I again held top secret clearances required for the modernized Situation Room in the White House, shown here, as well as the National Crisis Center at the Department of Homeland Security, intense wargaming exercises called red teaming, and meetings deep inside a highly classified, massive underground mountain hideaway. The Department of Agriculture's immediate priority was intensely protecting the safety of food and water in the United States in time of war. At the Department of Education, I worked with Homeland Security in countering terrorist threats toward schools. Next slide. Relationships formed, as we've heard tonight, during intense military experiences are often the most long-lasting. In August 2009, 36 years after my military service, I was invited taking an individual exclusive private tour of the Central Intelligence Agency at headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Returning to the lobby of the CIA, shown here, containing numerous gold stars commemorating the lives of unnamed CIA officers who had died in the line of duty, I experienced personal briefings and rare exhibits filling over 4 hours. Lots of stories, artifacts, documents, pictures, devices, and technologies spanning the original Office of Strategic Services through the Central Intelligence Agency's involvement in the Cold War, Vietnam, and Laos. Many memories for me, as well as Afghanistan, Iraq, and special covert missions. You can take that slide off, please, Alan. It is an honor serving in America's military.
Thank you, Ted. Excellent. And thank you to all the presenters tonight. You can see what a wide variety of experiences everyone had. I'm sure they all were learned a lot about life and working with other people, and it's a good example. It's a good experience if you make it through. If you don't, not so much. Okay, we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the next Zoom meetings we have coming up.
Kenny, did you want to take time for any questions? We got about 5 minutes or so.
Oh, we have 5 minutes? Okay.
Sure.
Yeah. Questions? Any questions?
Well, I'll step up and ask a question of Ted.
Yeah, Jeff.
You know, we did our job out there. We played it for real, and I had two good friends killed. And one of the things we learned from the Watergate tapes after we had left Vietnam, from a series of conversations between Kissinger and President Nixon, showing that they had determined very early in 1969 that the war was unwinnable. And meanwhile, 25,000 Americans were killed during the next 4 years that we remained in Vietnam. You were at the center of things. Did you have an understanding from your interactions with Kissinger and the other officials out there that this was a hopeless war?
I think their goal was to end the war, get our troops home with some sort of dignity. Whether it was unwinnable, I'm not sure it was unwinnable had we chosen to ignore some of the rules of combat and interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail. You mentioned Sihanouk and the trail itself, but the only way to have, quote, won the war, in my view, was to really stop the troops and supplies. And that probably would have only been temporary, because essentially it was a civil war, and it may have put a pause in what ultimately was the outcome. So that's the best I can offer you as to their insights and thinking.
Very good.
What rules of combat were you willing to ignore? You already said that we ignored the Geneva Accords, but what rules of combat was your group willing to ignore to win the war?
Well, you can't, I mean, all those countries are interconnected, as Jeff pointed out. And if you were to use ground troops, US ground troops instead of advisors, explicitly and in scale, it may have done a different outcome. Lam Son 719, which was a major operation, used South Vietnamese troops, advisors. You could have done more in Cambodia. So, and there was a lot of criticism, of course, of incursions into Cambodia and so forth. So there were a lot of limitations or choices, I suppose, better word, on what you could do and what couldn't do, either politically or internationally.
Ted, we'll continue this another time. I'm fascinated in what you say, because I have a sort of a standard speech that I've been giving for years, which my friends call Lieutenant Kelleher instructs the generals.
Well, Jeff, you're qualified, I can tell you that.
Well, it's a catalog of all of the mistakes that we made, military and otherwise, and it fits with what you were just saying. So we'll talk further sometime, I hope.
I would enjoy it. And I just finished reading, as maybe you have, Bob Bradley, who was behind us. John Stableford would remember, played hockey both at Deerfield and Williams, wrote a book recently published called Skipper of a Swift Boat Skipper. And you would know everything that's in that book, but I'd enjoy very much visiting with you.
Jeff, this is Larry Ricketts. I just want to give a historical perspective. My father was a Lieutenant JG on a PT boat, the Battle of Lady Gulf. They had wooden holes then,
Right.
go about 35 knots. So I really appreciated your talk. Thank you.
Good for your father. So did he ever encounter JFK out there?
It's funny you should ask. His first mate, Lenny Tom,
Right.
I can't remember the numbers. My dad was historical like you were. I'm not.
He was Kennedy's exec.
He was my father's first mate before he went on Kennedy's ship, and he's the one who pulled Kennedy out of the when they got hit. And he came back and got hit by his car stalled on a railroad track and got hit by a train.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
So-
he was, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
So, yeah.
Amazing all the
Amazing
connections.
connections. Exactly.
You know, my take on the military was that all countries' militaries are sort of the same. They're staffed by the same collection of characters, and he who wins is he who makes the fewer mistakes, because they all make mistakes and screw ups and all that, because that's who you've got in the military, and you just got to make sure that you don't make as many as the other guy. So.
Well, when watching you and your talk, throwing all that high-tech stuff at the Viet Cong, sometimes power doesn't always win either.
No, not a bit. But again, as I said, we were not accurate. We always had spotters on the ground. We had we had a Marine spotter on the shoreline once, and we asked him. I said, "Is that house that we see there? Is that our target?" He said, "No, I'm in it." So I said, okay then. Anyway, all right. Other questions or comments or observations?
I have a question for Jeff Kelleher.
Yep.
Jeff, how long were you on active duty out there on the rivers? And what was your frame of mind? Because I'm trying to imagine myself there, and I'd be psychotic. You know, I'd be afraid someone's going to shoot me every second of the day, or a mortar was going to hit me. Were you somehow look beyond it, or get immune to the danger and be calm in that situation?
I have a good friend that I play pickleball with who was an F4 pilot, and he flew 232 missions over the North. Something that terrifies me to think about. And I told him that, and he said, look, I flew one support mission to the Marines in I Corps, and I got to talk to the guys afterwards, and I said to them, I would never be able to do what you guys do. And so we all had our own little world that we lived in and accustomed ourselves to and made ourselves accept.
Okay.
Yeah, Phil? Yeah, you got to unmute yourself, Phil.
You're mute, Phil.
I'm wondering if any of the speakers have been to Vietnam since the war, and if so, what their experiences were like.
The answer is yes for me.
Can you tell us a little more about it, Jeff?
Sure, Phil. I'll tell you, I went in '94. Vietnam was just beginning to open up, and I went to every place that I fought. I hired sampans and junks. Wow. One of the guides I had when we went up the Vam Co Tay River up to Muc Wa had been a Viet Cong major, and he knew our boats, and he had attacked our boats. Wow. Anyway, I went everywhere in the Central Delta, up to the north in Na Bay, the Rung Sat Special Zone, every place where I fought, everything was the same as 25 years earlier. Nothing had changed. Right down to our floating pontoons. There they were, sitting on the bank in Muc Wa. I went to the naval base at Na Bay, and I actually talked my way into it. And there, and the base was exactly the same as it was 25 years earlier, except that on one of the tall 4-story walls was a painting of Ho Chi Minh as a Navy admiral. But that's enough to say. I mean, everything was the same.
Unbelievable.
It's very different now. I mean, in the years since, I mean, Vietnam has been transformed, but back then it had stagnated for 25 years.
Comment I could add is that when I went to visit, the guides we had, the Vietnamese guides said we were just completely mistaken with the whole domino theory about the Chinese coming in, that the Vietnamese hated the Chinese. 1,000 years they've hated them. They didn't like the French for 150 years. And we were only there 25 years. They still like us. So huge mistake was that we thought it was a domino theory. The Chinese were going to take over the North and then the South. And if you start with that mistaken strategy, you'll make a lot of other mistakes.
I don't think we should leave this without asking whether anybody remembers who we lost in Vietnam of our classmates. I think we lost a couple.
I remember Bill Gilger. He left his freshman year to fight, and his name is now on the memorial in Washington.
David Adams.
You're right.
Yeah, Larry, I actually pulled out our 50th reunion book, which was really well done. And in the back of that, there's memory of people who have passed away, a number of whom were in the service and in Vietnam. That's a good source of those that gave that.
Thanks. And then I speak for one other person that wasn't able to speak today, Arnie Heller, who I paid when he was coming out of the service when I was in Fort Lewis. Arnie immediately went from basic training over to Vietnam as a Army grunt and was out in the jungles, I think, for about a month and a half. And then he went into Saigon, luckily to desk duty. But Arnie, when I paid him, did not want to talk about his experience.
David Brooks, who dropped out of Williams, and I think he went into the infantry. He died in Vietnam.
Yeah, I actually reached out to some others of our classmates who just preferred not to share their experiences. So, anything else? Okay, Alan, we want to pitch our next Zoom meetings. I think February 19th, we've got our next one up. And was Bob Conway going to give us a comment on that?
Bob's going to be the moderator. Bob, are you still here? Yeah, there you are. Want to unmute yourself, please?
Yep. Okay, so in a month, we're going to be moving from Vietnam to Williamstown and from war to art. And we have the liaison between the construction of the new museum and the art department, whose name is Devin Nolan. She is an artist by choice, but trained in collection management and construction management. She's very bright. She knows a lot. She'll be telling us all about the construction of the new museum, the intent of the design, particularly its very high levels of sustainability. And she'll also give us, which I wasn't expecting, but I'm very pleased to hear, a short history on how the museum at Williams evolved from essentially a passive, uninhabited little space in Lawrence Hall to a very active, quote unquote, teaching museum with many of the departments and many classes within those departments at the college using the resources of the museum as part of their educational curriculum. So I hope all of you will be there. I'm looking forward to it. I've already learned a lot from chatting with her, and I think it'll be a great session.
Great, thanks, Bob. And that's February 19th, right, Alan?
Right.
Okay. And then on March 19th, we've got Bill Scott. And Bill, do you want to give a tickler on that?
Yeah, I'll just say, boy, it's kind of sobering to hear some of the stories that I just heard about Vietnam, and the contrast might be taking it up to the present. Have a project that's taken me to many different places where I teach students and involve them in some projects that could help other people. But it's taken me to Cuba, it's taken me to Russia, it took me just this past September to Ukraine. So I'll have some reflections on my experience in Cuba and reflections on my experience on Ukraine. And it'll be a story that kind of weaves together both the personal experiences I have there, but some sense of what those countries are like right now and what they're suffering through. So,
Bill, I will be there in spades. I visited both Cuba and Ukraine in the last year and a half.
oh boy, what you know how much Cuba's changed with just over the last 2 or 3 years. You know, it's just a real disaster area. And of course, Ukraine. Where were you in Ukraine, Jeff?
Well, I took the bus from Warsaw to Kyiv, so I went all the way across 2/3 of the country and then lodged for a week in Kyiv and went out to some of the battlefields from the early days of the war.
Oh boy.
I didn't go down to the eastern part.
Yeah, so my travel did take me to Kyiv too. I took the train, which was quite an experience too, from Poland.
Well, this should be an interesting, we got 2 interesting sessions coming up. I hope you can all make it. Again, my thanks to all the presenters this evening. Fascinating stories and from all over the place. We were all over